Hey, writers and readers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In today's episode, I'm joined by author and game designer Gareth Hanrahan. His new novel, The Gutter Prayer, is a brilliant mashup of fantasy, alchemical steampunk, and Lovecraftian horror. It follows three unlikely companions, a thief, a stone man, and a ghoul, as they are pulled headlong into their ancient city's hidden magical war. The Gutter Prayer is available now in stores everywhere from Orbit Books. Gareth, welcome to Fictitious.
Hello, and thanks for having me on.
As people will probably figure out very quickly into this, you are Irish and in Ireland right now as we speak, so that will explain the difference in accent here.
Indeed. I hope I'm vaguely comprehensible.
I think we'll be in good shape, yeah. As I was trying to write the description for The Gutter Prayer, I felt like I was having what I think of as a good kind of problem, which is figuring out how to give the pithy elevator pitch for it, because it is, it's a very different kind of fantasy, which is really exciting to me. I like things that mash up genres and twist them in new ways, and I feel like there's a lot of really fresh, interesting stuff going on in here. So can you kind of tell me what The Gutter Prayer is all about?
The elevator pitch is three thieves seeking revenge on the master of the Thieves Guild who betrayed them and using this strange new power they discovered to take revenge on him. But yeah, it goes from that starting point and sprawls off in all sorts of unexpected directions, which I don't want to give too much away of. But it's very much about basically you have a city in one level of equilibrium and then you give it a big kick. And you see what happens and how all the various power structures react and how old powers show up again and go, we are evil old powers.
As they do, as they're wont to do. Yeah.
Indeed.
It's an interesting setup because in a way it's it's an urban fantasy because it is set all in the city that I'm going to totally blow the pronunciation on. So what is the name of the city?
It's Guerdon.
Guerdon. Okay, that's how I said it. I heard it in my head, so that's good, yeah.
It's actually a real word.
Really?
Yep. It's an Old English word. It means reward or payment.
Oh, well, Guerdon is a really fascinating setting for this story because, as it's explained pretty early on, the city has been destroyed and rebuilt and rediscovered by people and gods over time. And so it is this sort of train wreck of deity worship and really strange, very dark goings-ons from way, way back. But that a lot of those things are hidden in plain view, and the populace of that city aren't really all that aware of some of the nasty things that they're built on top of, or they choose not to be aware, which is probably how we are a lot in the real world, where we don't like to look at those things.
Completely. I mean, large chunks of the history are based on cities like London or even Cork and Edinburgh and places where you have the bones of the past sticking out everywhere. Where I'm sitting right now, if I throw a stone over a wall, you're actually in this hospital, which back 150 years ago was a famine workhouse. But you walk past it every day and never think that it was created in this time of huge hardship. Any old city is going to have all sorts of interesting nooks and crannies and bits in its past.
Yeah, I think that sometimes for American audiences, those kinds of concepts are both really intriguing, but also a little foreign because as Americans, we tend to get oh, wow, this building's 100 years old. Wow, it's so ancient because we're a very young country and other places in the world have these much longer, rich histories. And like you said, you can walk around and see the hints of things peeking out at you from the past, but not know the context of them. And with Guerdon, then, this is a city populated by humans, but humans in a lot of different variations in the sense that you have people going through this crazy disease that causes them to literally turn to stone over time, which creates the stonemen, and which one of your three kind of core protagonists, Spar, is one of. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, this disease that is slowly taking a person's life away, but at the same time, they're getting stronger all the time because of it. It's the weirdness of the curse is that the farther along in their disease, the stronger they are. Was there a particular impetus for that, an inspiration for that idea?
Most inspiration I find is sort of confluence of things. There wasn't one sort of light bulb moment where, this is a good idea. Part of it was I hurt my back a few years ago and spent a few months basically lying in bed. So when I started writing the novel, I was still quite sore and had to move very carefully. So a lot of that got sort of channeled into the character. Part of it was that the first character I created, Caroline Carey, who's the main character pretty much, her gimmick was basically that she was very, very active. She very impulsive. She'd run off and do something. So as a contrast, I wanted a character who was a lot more sort of slow and stolid and slower to react. And then there was just the innate body horror of being slowly petrified, sort of locked-in syndrome. And the whole getting stronger bit was really just to sort of to make the character more useful as opposed to just stumbling around going, I can't move and I'm slowly dying, but at least I can punch things really hard.
That idea of of somebody who is going through, like you said, this body horror, their own body is turning into a cage around them, and yet the anger and frustration of that can also be channeled into great strength, I think is a really interesting balance. And like you said, Carol and Carrie, ostensibly the sort of the main character of the story, and then Spar, you have that balance. And then the third member of their little trio is Rat, who is a ghoul, who is this humanoid underdweller who is become aligned with some of the surface-dwelling humans. The ghouls have a really interesting place in this world, and particularly with this idea that they evolve over time into these really creepy elder things. And it does have this sort of Lovecraftian creepiness to them. When you're putting together a character like Ghoul, he literally eats the dead. He's a carrion devouring creature. And that's an unusual person to put as a POV perspective. So how do you work that out and make a character like that has to do that stuff and keep them, empathetic for the reader?
I absolutely hold my hands up and say that he was stolen straight from Lovecraft. I've done loads of Lovecraftian stuff in the gaming industry, so there are parts of Lovecraft I really, really like, or parts of his creations anyway. The man himself is questionable.
Yes.
But I wanted basically to have ghouls as a main character. And then it was actually almost easy to make him sympathetic in some ways because his sort of personal habits were so off-putting and his instincts so animalistic that you sort of had to really sort of seize on the moments where he was sympathetic and magnify those. So he does a bit of sort of dogged sense of friendship and sort of mordant humour, which was fun to write. So really it was basically just any time he showed the slightest bit of humanity or empathy, you seized on that and went, yes, look, he's okay, he's nice.
I'm a D&D Pathfinder player, and I always think that the most fun campaigns are the ones where you have characters that are really bizarre combinations to put together because they give you access to areas and worlds that you wouldn't see otherwise and different reactions to people. In this city, the Stonemen are all around, but they're plague carriers, essentially. People can't come into contact with them. They've gotten used to them over time, but they're, a weird thing. The ghouls, and the crawling ones, which I will leave best the book to describe when people encounter them because the crawling ones are pretty fascinating and creepy and nasty. And I felt like it was an interesting thing. You introduced this idea of these very nasty things and they're like, oh God, these things are in the deep and they're disgusting. And then they start showing up around you in the surface dwelling world. And I was like, oh, that's a surprising turn. I didn't expect to see them masquerading in plain sight.
Yeah, I love shifting context, especially if shifting context of monsters. You come up with this thing that works in one particular space, evil worm monster crawling thing in a dungeon, and that's fine, that's almost expected. You know how it works down there. But then you take the same creature and shift it into a university lecture theatre, or a shopping centre, or working as a journalist in a newspaper, and you go out there going, okay, how would that work then? It's great at sort of sparking new ideas and story options to sort of take a thing out of its natural context, shove it into something absolutely incongruous and go, okay, how does this work from here?
And I think in a way, that also describes the city, because the city, this is a fantasy world. This is a sword and sorcery, but also guns and bombs and universities and trains. And that's why I made the steampunk comparison, because there's a lot of what we would think of as not modern tech, but as, sort of pseudo-modern technology alongside all of this stuff. And that gives you so many interesting places to go. But I feel like it's also one of those pitfalls as far as at what point are you breaking your own rules? How do you keep the world building together? So as you were constructing this world, how did you keep track of those details? How do you balance magic versus those kinds of technological elements?
I think I sort of cheat to a degree because I've been designing role-playing games for nearly 20 years at this point and running games for even longer. So I think at this point a fairly sort of keenly developed instinct for what will break a system and what will cause problems for me further down the line. So a lot of the time I would just sort of throw an idea out there, there's an alchemist guild. And I had no idea initially how that was going to factor in, even though it's a major part of the story. But I knew that if as long as I sort of kept it manageable and didn't describe to them too much little power, I'd be able to bounce other balls off that and keep everything moving along. It was more sort of instinct and a feeling for how different forces they would push off each other, reach some level of equilibrium, more than sort of careful design or anything. When I started the story, I had no idea at all where it was going.
Well, that's one question I asked most writers on the show is like if they are outliners, if they are pantsers, like how this thing's coming together. So yeah, it sounds like that you were not an outliner in this case. You were just following the thread.
I sort of both. I started off, wrote the first 20,000 or so words with not absolutely no idea where it was going, but very, very little idea of who the characters were, what was going on. Would write down either evocative words or bring back ideas I'd come up with like years ago but had no purpose for, like, the Taliban have been sort of floating around as an idea for years in the back of my head, and just dropped them into the story without an idea of where it would go. And wrote the first 20,000 words, stopped dead, left it for several months, and eventually came back to it and went, okay, here's my starting point, where does it go from here? And then I did an outline based on the elements I'd already created, and okay, I've mentioned this faction, this group, this bit of weirdness, I have all these weird pretentious events, I'm going to have to bring all those back in and fit them into the plot somehow, but I'll go from there. It's like, start your jigsaw once you've done the corners. You're not sure where it's all going to go in the end, but you have the rough frame of it.
Right. Yeah. Having a framework, I mean, it gives you something to kind of hang the rest on, and you can figure out a way through. I'm glad you mentioned the influence of your work as a game designer, because like you said, like you've been doing that for a really long time. I think that's a pretty unique perspective amongst the people that, that I talk to who are writing stuff, because you've been writing for years in systems that allow for interactivity and flexibility and have to kind of go a bunch of different directions. So was it liberating going into this to be like, okay, now I can really just completely control the flow and I take it wherever I want it to go? Or is it daunting to have to actually make those decisions? Or how did you feel about that?
Oh, it was ghastly. I'm so used to writing settings where there are players there to make the decisions of the protagonist for me, and I go, okay, I react to those. So before the Gutter Prayer, I never finished writing several novels where I'd set up this very interesting situation, I'd have all the supporting cast, I'd have the villains, and then I'd go, right, and then what happens? But because I didn't have a protagonist, it all went nowhere. So when I started the Gutter Prayer, I went, right, I'm going to have this point of view character, Carolyn, who is super impulsive, will just run and jump and react to whatever I throw at her. And so everything sort of stemmed from there. I could only write when I had a protagonist who would basically just run and do protagonisty stuff at the drop of a hat.
I've got to imagine that in the world building process with that game design background that you couldn't help start thinking about it in the sort of numbers and frameworks of a game. In your notes, do you have things broken out where you're like, Spar has a 17 strength or something like that? Or, I mean, like, are those things in there as, as part of like your context?
They wouldn't be explicitly as broken down as actually doing stats for the characters, although I could do it with 6 different systems. But I would definitely have a sort of mental map of how powerful characters are relatively in different fields. For example, Kelkin, who is the leader of the opposition in the city's parliament, is just this little old man. All he has is political sway, but he is massively influential. Whereas you have lots of street level sorcerers and thieves and fighters who are physically far more powerful, but because it's a fairly civilized, organized, lawful setting, it's not just sword and sorcery where might makes right. There are strings to be pulled.
You mentioned a couple minutes ago the Talomen, and really early on we get introduced to this peacekeeping law enforcement aspect in the city, who are literally humanoid creatures that are essentially candles. They have this alchemical burning fire that animates them, and they are immensely dangerous. And this idea, I couldn't help but almost think of from Beauty and the Beast, there's the one candle guy that runs around in that. And I was like, oh, it's like him, except for he's a murderous bastard. And he's big and dangerous and nearly unstoppable. You mentioned that that's an idea you've been sitting on for a long time. So how did you balance that out in the story and kind of flesh out that idea?
My sort of mental image is, have you ever seen this exhibition of preserved bodies that goes around to various countries? Like a human anatomy thing where they've got these bodies which have been dipped in some plasticizing preservative, and they're just freaky to look at.
Yeah, it's like Body Works or something like that.
That's the one, yeah. And wax in general is just this unwholesome substance in a lot of ways, because the way it's changes consistency, it's soft, it's hard, it's liquid, it's got associations of heat. There was a level of sort of freakiness that fed into them. And then in terms of fitting them into the story, really they serve the function of basically being the bad guys enforcers, but they're lovely and distinctive and thematic.
there's a scene towards like the middle of the book that you have this, again, sort of a Lovecraftian horror of a thing called a Raveler, which is deeply distressing thing to exist in any world, versus like dozens of the Talamen. And it's just, it would be a bloodbath except for none of them have blood. I thought that was a really interesting moment to have a thing going on in front of several of these POV characters in the straight, like, there's not a one of us that have any ability to fight in this, and we just have to get away from it. And I thought it was interesting to look at this world where the characters are often remarking on the sheer volume of powerful things that exist. There's this war that's going on at some distance away called the Gods' War, where there are literally deities who will come to Earth or have their saints, their, avatars on Earth fight for them, and these things are going on. And so these are people that are living in a world where the gods are not only something that are worshipped, but like physically show up sometimes. And that's really distressing.
Oh, there's a level of absolute, cosmic horror to the whole thing, where, the gods definitely exist, and they're mad, and they possibly hate you just because of, what country you come from, or what your job is. They're or what city you live in. And there's a massive sort of discontinuity of power level from the street thieves our characters start off as, all the way up to basically, living incarnations of deities. But the challenges and the elements I really liked was that Guerdon, the city, tries to maintain a level of normality on this sea of absolute chaos.
That idea of all of these people are trying to go about their business. They just have jobs. They're going to university. They're, working whatever, means in order to keep their family fed. And then at the same time, there are absolutely nutty things happening about them. And they are in, Guerdon is supposed to be a neutral city. It's essentially the Switzerland of this mess of a universe, because they don't take a side in any of these other wars. They're selling weapons and alchemical disasters to all these different people. And I thought that was an interesting place to put a city, that it's, instead of like this sort of war-torn situation, they're instead sitting not at the calm at the center of the storm, because there is plenty of storm underneath them, but they are operating in a neutral zone where they feel like, oh, things are okay because we're here. Even when it's crappy, at least the gods aren't tearing us down.
One of the initial inspirations, I was walking around Tesco, which is basically a big supermarket, like Walmart or whatever in the States, and worrying about climate change, and looking at vegetables that have been flown from hundreds of miles away, and looking at all the people zooming in and out and going, oh god, what if suddenly all the cars stopped and all the trucks stopped moving and the supply chains break down. It's the whole any civilization is 3 meals away from anarchy. And I sort of took that sort of worry about the fate of the world and went, okay, what if it wasn't just natural forces happening? What if there were supernatural forces had the same level of impending doom? Because what if the gods went crazy one day?
Yeah, and the undercurrent here, particularly with Carrie, and again, with not giving too much away, is that, some of these ancient gods have been kicking around for a while, and they're in Guerdon, and they're, maybe getting a little impatient about, sitting there. There is an interesting POV perspective in this book. I mean, I will say, too, that, we have those 3 main characters. They're all POV characters, but we also see through the eyes of a number of other people in this story. There's a thief catcher who figures in fairly prominently. There is another young student and relative of Carrie who, we see as a POV character. But every once in a while, we get these completely different aspects where we're seeing through the many, many eyes and very fractured and different point of view of something interesting in the city. And that felt like a really, really strong framing device that also leaves the reader a little off kilter for a while, as far as like what am I seeing and how am I seeing this? So when you're constructing that part of the narrative, is that something that came early on that you figured you wanted to do? Did you add that into later drafts? When did you figure that part out?
The book was written pretty much start to finish in order. So I started with the prologue, which is sort of infamously in second person. It starts you stand on a rooftop or stand on a hilltop overlooking the city, and the first few pages are all second person. Do you want the honest answer or the clever answer as to why did that?
I would love to hear both.
The clever answer is, as I say, I wanted this perspective from these entities who are explained as the story goes on, but at the start, no one knows about them. And if I'd done it as first person, A would have been very out of phase with the rest of the book, because the rest of the book is all third person. And also, if you say, I am standing on a hilltop over Guerdon, you're still going, okay, who are you? If you're saying I, then that implies a level of knowledge about yourself, which these guys don't have. Similarly, if I'd done third person, it is standing on a hilltop above Guerdon, then that sort of shifts the blame from the character to the author. It's like, okay, you're telling me about this guy standing on a hilltop. Who is he? Why are you holding this information back? Why are you not telling me these things? But if I start with you, then I put the problem onto you. You are standing on a hilltop. You don't know who you are? That's your problem. That's the clever answer. The honest answer is just, in role-playing games, you is pretty much the vernacular. Like, you enter a dungeon, you walk down a corridor. So I was very, very comfortable with starting in second person and then shifting over to third once I sort of had the feel of the story and had my feet under me.
I did not make that connection, but that makes perfect sense that narrative would be the home for you. That would, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I sometimes, I always wonder how initial readers and editors react when they get things like that, because, third person or first person are kind of our de facto. And when you get something like that's either like in second person or you get third person or even first person, but present tense, when you're like, throwing off the feel, that can feel jarring for readers sometimes. And it needs a really good reason for that. Did you run into any challenges when your first readers encountered that stuff where they're like, I feel like that switch back and forth is jarring, or did people get it right away and it made sense to them?
A few people were turned off by it. A friend of mine basically picked up the book, read the first chapter, went, "You pretentious git, second person." Pretty much threw the book across the table at me in disgust. I think the fact that it is a relatively short prologue and it does shift to something more conventional after that is reassuring for readers. I mean, there are books I've read which do that whole thing all the way through. I think that is over the top because it is an unnatural way to read. But I think as sort of a quick flag at the moment that this book is going to be a bit odd and off-putting at times. You can stop here if you want, but we're giving you fair warning.
Right off at the start there, then, you can feel that there's a different kind of tone and narrative style to this. You do get into, traditional third person past tense when you go forward with it. But I do notice that there's something I would think of as kind of like a lyrical quality to some of the writing that you have there. Even down to, I feel like there are certain passages, and it feels deliberate to me, where there are certain passages where I feel like you almost build refrains into parts of the language, where like there'll be a repeated line or perhaps like a certain variation of it a couple of times. And it feels, like I said, sort of lyrical, like it's got like almost like a musical component to how it's put together. Is that a very deliberate thing on your end and kind of piecing that language together, or is it just something that came naturally?
I tried very much to have each point of view chapter, the language very much reflect the character. So Carrie tends to have very, very sort of quick, short sentences, sentence fragments. There's a lot of missing pronouns and so forth. She turns a corner, running down the alleyway, jumping up to the windowsill, just trying to keep the sentence short to reflect that speed. Whereas Spar tends to be a lot more ponderous and have a lot more thoughtful, circular passages where he's thinking about things and considering the past and being much more deliberate in his actions. And then Rat it's all about smells and textures and tastes more than anything else. And I suspect, because I was sort of keeping that in mind the whole time, that those sort of repeated phrases would sort of just crop up again and again because they were, I guess, subconsciously keyed to my conception of that character. So they would be sort of go-to lines, which is possibly the most pretentious way ever to say I'm a bit lazy. Thinking about it.
It never struck me that way. It always just felt like...
Thank you.
Yeah, I felt like it punctuated things well. I like that you mentioned the sort of sentence fragments too, because there are places where you do drop in a fragment, something that that's just a piece of description or something that really hammers a point home about the scene, and you don't have to belabor it with some, incredibly word count padding sentence. You just get a piece in there. How did your editors react to that? Did they realize stylistically how that worked immediately, or did you have to kind of fight for that?
There were a few places where sentences were made readable and grammatical, where I had gone too far and had just lost clarity. It's one thing to try and put the reader in the moment and get the reader's heart pounding by having the action on the written page be as fast as a knife fight or whatever. But if you go too far down, it just becomes impenetrable, slash, stab. Blood, which while it might be emotively accurate to the situation, you can't read it like that. You can't know what's going on. So it's a question of just finding a balance, trying to convey speed and action and immediacy without losing descriptive quality. But everything's a balancing act, and that's one of the virtues of having an editor where they can go, no, you're just babbling here. You might know what's going on, but no one else does.
That's a great challenge for every author. When you live with something so alive in your head, you can see it from every angle. You have that multifaceted POV where that whole world exists there, but then putting it onto the page and making sure that the reader actually understands it, that they can feel it. I think you see in a lot of early drafts, particularly from new authors or people that are, I don't want to say aspiring authors, because if you're a writer, but that are just getting started in their journey with it, that they do have a lot of clarity issues as far as getting those things onto the page so people understand what this is, and they get the stuff that's all those things that are alive in their head have to make it to the page. What challenges did you run into in putting this together? I mean, you said that you had started it, sat on it for a while, came back to it with greater clarity, and, figured out that framework. Were there any big challenges, something you really ran your head against that you had to overcome, and how did you do that?
The biggest challenge was just starting again and finishing it. And the resource I used was my wife, who said, go and finish that book before you start a new one. I was terrible for, doing the whole, I'd write the first 3 chapters or something, bump up against some obstacle and go, this isn't working because it is not the right book. I have not found that moment of crystal inspiration that will carry me through 100,000 words. I should start again with an entirely new plot, a new set of characters, and that'll be the one that works. Whereas, really, it's just a question of grinding through. With the Gutter Prayer, would say, once I returned to it and actually outlined it and went, okay, I know roughly what's happening for the next 15 chapters. Write those, then outline again. Because the second half, once your action has, or your the volume of the story has reached the sort of critical mass, and you've got to start bringing events back in and killing off characters and resolving plot lines as opposed to adding new complexity. The downhill slope is a lot easier because okay, I've got to check off these open plot lines. I've got to resolve this character's arc, this character's arc, this character's arc. The second half of the book is a lot easier to write than the first half, because the first half, while you've got far more freedom, it's also basically sort of climbing up a mountain because you're not sure if this plotline is going to pay off, or not sure where things are going, or if you're just sort of writing into the void.
I've never thought about it that way before, but I like that idea of the start and the middle of the book is essentially creating a checklist, and the end of it is checking those things off. And if you want readers to be satisfied, you have to check those boxes, because that's, especially in films and books and things, you do hear it when readers will complain about things, a lot of times it'll be because there's plot points that didn't resolve themselves or didn't do it in a satisfactory sense, or nobody likes the dangling participle, of a story thread that doesn't get pulled together. So I like, that's an interesting metaphor that you're creating your own checklist and then completing it.
The great thing is then you start getting new ideas, because you go, okay, I've got plot A and plot B. Oh, if I have those cross over, they can basically cancel each other out. They can resolve each other. If I've got this mysterious murder back in chapter 3, and I've got this mysterious organization which I've been talking about. They're the guys who killed him. Now that whole fits together. And what I also found, which scares me on one level, is that I'd often have created stuff in throwaway comments early on that proved to be fantastically useful in this the second half of the book. I go, I just threw that in as random background flavor. Was it my subconscious planning this all along, or am I just picking up those ideas and using them? It's slightly disconcerting when you feel that someone else is helping you write the book.
Yeah, when that background process is running in there, and you're my BIOS is still going in the background while I'm doing other stuff, and it's figuring it out for me. Hey, brain, thanks for being there.
Exactly. Or the issue is your brain is never so useful as to write you short bullet point notes. Here is why you did this. You still have to work it out.
It's sort of a role-playing game against your own mind. The background of your brain is a DM that's not going to quite hand it to you. You do actually have to figure it out on your own. But all the pieces are there, ideally.
Exactly.
The Gutter Prayer is the first book in a series, the Black Iron Legacy. I'm going to assume that you're working on the follow-up books now. How is that writing experience versus writing the first book?
I've handed in a draft of the second book, or second draft of the second book. The second book was actually a lot harder to write in some ways. In my ways, it was a lot easier because now I had all these characters and this established backstory which I could draw on, and there was so much stuff that happened in the first book that I could have characters reacting to those events and building on them. So I didn't have the same issue with a lack of protagonist. Quite the opposite. I had 3 protagonists we had to fend off. The challenge, though, was more a structural one, because I had no idea where the Gutter Prayer was going when I started writing it, and wrote it basically not just for my own entertainment, but without any real plan towards publication or deadline or anything. So it took a while and wasn't consciously designed to be commercial or even sellable. With this, it's written to deadline, it's written to specification. So I went a bit overboard on planning and ordering and did this like lovely detailed, perfectly symmetrical outline, with the result that the first draft was absolutely dead in terms of pacing. It had a lot more editorial wrangling to be done on that, but I hope the second draft is a lot smoother.
I hear that a lot of writers will say that they're surprised at just how tough the sequel is because, yeah, there's expectations now. It's less freewheeling. There's a little bit more weight on top of it. And then the connective tissue of like a second book in a trilogy or you know, in an ongoing series, like that sophomore effort is a lot of times like a greater difficulty. So you said you ran into that problem of like the first draft had dead pacing or it wasn't working as well. Is that a case where your editor was really stepping in and giving you a big hand or you know, poking you to get you in the right places, or were you kind of realigning your thought process on it?
My editor, Emily at Orbit, she was fantastic. No, she gave very, very detailed notes and sort of an overview of the parts that weren't working. And going through it was like, you know, oh yeah, you're entirely right there. You're entirely right there. An editor can only sort of show you where you've gone wrong. You still have to find the solution that works for you. And a lot of it was just basically breaking up perspectives and moving text around. There was like chunks of rewriting, but a lot of it was just restructuring it, which was interesting because I that was actually an awful lot of work because there's a lot of sort of connective tissue in a novel. And if you move like, you know, one chapter, just a few pages, there's all the like little minor events and bits of language have to be adjusted. So a lot of very sort of fiddly editing and like, you know, sorting out timelines and things, and all with sort of the continual consciousness of a deadline. Which is always fun.
The deadline's both a blessing and a curse, for sure. You talk about like, moving those pieces around. You know, these novels are tens and tens and tens of thousands of words, and being able to keep all those pieces straight and moving them around. What's your methodology for that? Like, what software are you using, and how do you move those things around and kind of track your versions?
I use Scrivener. The reason I started using Scrivener was that it wasn't Word. My day job is a freelance writer for role-playing games, which means that my 9-to-5 job is sitting there making up nonsense about elves and dwarves and goblins and giant monsters. And I get paid by the word or by the hour on those things. So when I was writing a novel, I had to sort of consciously take time for myself, going, right, I'm not getting paid for this time. This is time I could be using to do actual real work. And I'm sort of like, you know, stealing time from my family and relaxing and so forth to write this novel. So to make a distinct separation between time spent on the computer working and time spent on the computer on the novel, I said, okay, I'll use a different software package. So I grabbed Scrivener because I heard, like, you know, it's the novel thing to use. That was moderately useful for the gutter prayer, but when it came to the sequel and I had to move all this like chapters around, it was an absolute blessing then just to be able to, like, you know, grab whole chunks of text and have it all reflow naturally. So yeah, it was all done Scrivener and then output to Word for editing and fixes.
Scrivener can be very daunting for people when they first jump in, but that ability to break up your different pieces into elements that can be moved around in a timeline and stuff, it's so liberating. It gives you so much flexibility.
Yeah, and you can focus on individual scenes because Word does not have a natural break for scenes. It's all one document or lots of small individual documents, whereas Scrivener lets you move seamlessly between the two. So I'm a big fan of Scrivener for that. But I tried doing like other books, like role-playing books in Scrivener, and it just didn't work at all, which was interesting.
Well, sometimes it is nice to have a different methodology so you can change course. I mean, I was going to say, like, since you do write all day anyway, there's got to be some sort of way that you can disconnect your brain and then move on to that other project, whether that's writing in a different space or using some other kind of tool or whatever, just to divide that up.
Yeah, I mean, or context shifting is a really useful thing, like different music. Or the whole trick with editing to, like, you know, just change the font and even the color of the text, just have the document look very different to when you're writing it, so you can look at it with fresh eyes. There are lots and lots of tricks for tricking the brain into thinking that, like, you know, I haven't spent the last 16 hours with the computer.
Yeah. Are there any other like tools of the trade that you turn to? Do you do pen and paper stuff? Do you shift to different spaces to write or work?
No. I've used pen and paper just for like random notes, but I've learned to write like anywhere, anywhen, because earlier in my career I had very, very, very punishing deadlines for another company. So I just learned that like any time when you're sitting at any computer can be used for writing.
That's a good point, because I think triggers and stuff that that tell you that, okay, I am in the mode to write and in the mode to work are helpful. But I think people do get glued to this idea, this fanciful idea of I'm a writer and I get my favorite mug and I wear my writer robe and my writer slippers and I sit down at my writer desk and yeah.
Yeah, I fell into writing at a very young age. Have been a full-time writer since I was 23, I think. And it was largely by accident. I had a computer job, got laid off, said I'll try writing for 3 months and see where it takes me, and kept going from that. But that meant that from first day one, it was write or starve.
Yeah.
and once you know that your rent is dependent on getting this particular monster supplement in that morning, you learn just to go, right, okay, I will write in this coffee shop, I'll write in this McDonald's, I'll write on this bus, whatever works.
I'm going to pull that away and maybe even make a graphic that people can just print out and stick up, write or starve. I think that's a pretty powerful motivator right there.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not like a sensible or mature career path, but it definitely does help you focus your ability to sort of sit down and get work done.
Yeah, I was going to say, that'll wash you out if you are not ready for that kind of career. So that'll do the thing. When you are not writing, because it sounds like you do that 85% of your waking hours.
And on a healthy amount, certainly.
When you do have time, what else are you reading, watching, playing that is kind of feeding your brain right now?
I tend to be fairly omnivorous. I'm listening to an awful lot of podcasts, mostly on news and current events. And there's also ones that give in-depth things on fairly random topics. Have you ever listened to the BBC's In Our Time series?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I really enjoy that one. Yeah.
That's a fantastic resource because just here is a topic you know nothing about. We will give you a in-depth thesis on it for the next half hour. Currently reading, I'm in the middle of a book called Hyperfocus, which I find that I get into very good habits for a few months in terms of writing discipline and focus and turning off Twitter. And then I sort of slouch down and slump and spend half my day checking the news or messing around or playing Bejeweled, and I need something to sort of snap me back. Deadlines help, but also books like Hyperfocus, which is about basically training your brain to stay focused on topic. And other things, I should actually know what I'm watching, but I'm not watching much at the moment.
As a game designer, do you spend a lot of time playing? are you DMing your own games and stuff like that? Do you actually have time to enjoy it?
Oh yeah, you sort of have to keep your hand in and keep the connection between what you're writing and and the actual end product. I've been playing in a Star Wars game for the last few months. Oh, that's probably going to come to an end fairly soon, given that there are going to be 3 of the players are having kids in the next 3 months.
Oh, that is a nightmare for a game group. Yeah, that group's over.
It'll be on pause for a while. Yeah. But yeah, my wife and I had twins there 6 years ago, and that hampered gaming and writing for a while.
I used to work in a comics and game store right after I got out of college, and we always had the understanding that people would cut gaming or comics out of their buying habits whenever they got married, whenever they had kids, or if they lost their job. You knew if somebody came in, they're like, "Oh man, I'm getting married," we'd be like, "Okay, we'll put your poll on hold for now because it's not going to happen for a little while." It's it was just a fact of life that it almost always went that way.
But I think it's getting easier to come back to it. Certainly, when I was in college, older people would have kids and they would just drop out of the nerd scene completely. And these days now, at the local games convention, we basically have a creche at the con because so many people are coming back and playing games, but also bringing their kids along. I was playing board games with the boys a few hours ago before we recorded this.
In my gaming group, one of my friend Travis, when he comes home every night, the next day he has to tell his daughter all about the adventure. Because she's a total she's a dark-minded kid. She loves monsters and she can't wait to play D&D and stuff like that. And so she wants to hear about everything that we did. For her, that's a super exciting thing. Oh, Dad, what did your half-orc cleric do last night? And when I see her, she's 8 or 9, and she will immediately tell me, "Oh, I heard about what Valor did in that last adventure." And I'm like, "Wow, you know the story better than I do, and I was there." So yeah, I love seeing the nerd crowd bring their kids into it. And being a part of, like, I go to to conventions, comic conventions and stuff. I sort of live at that on that scene, and seeing, you know, that generation bring in their children into it and enjoy those things together. It's just so cool. It's so really, really, really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I've got the boys like playing like very, very simple role-playing games already. So basically, it's not much like you breaking up one gaming group as building another one.
Right, yeah. I would say that is raising them right, for sure. Gareth, as we wrap up here, where should people be following you and your work online?
The sort of center of my internet universe at the moment is Twitter, where you can find me at Mytholder, MYTHOLDER. There'll be a link in the show notes or something, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've had that handle online since 1996, so I'm not going to give it up now.
Well done. Grab your branding early and like hold it with an iron fist for sure.
Grab my branding early and make sure no one else can spell it. But it is good for search engine optimization. I have a blog at garhanrahan.wordpress.com. I should really sort out a domain name at some point. And The Gutter Prayer is available from Orbit Books and all good bookshops. Yeah,
the book is out now. It's awesome. I love that blend of fantasy and horror and tech, and I don't know. I felt like the book is full of interesting ideas. Like every few pages where I get hit by another thing where I'm like, oh, there's just so much in here. I didn't know as I started writing that you had a game design background, but I was already 100 pages in and thinking, man, I want to kind of play this, as well. So maybe we'll see a Gutter Prayer, Black Iron Legacy game somewhere in the future.
I think it'd be very, very, very foolish to rule it out, certainly given my background.
Yeah. Probably a pretty solid bet, I would think.
I think so.
Well, Gareth, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious. Everybody should be reading this book. It's really exciting, fresh fantasy, and I look forward to getting my hands on the second one whenever that arrives. So thank you so much for being on Fictitious.
Thank you.
The home for all things Fictitious, including every episode and review, is fictitiouspodcast.com. You can find the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Fictitious Pod, and you can chat with me directly on Twitter, where I'm at Adrian Buskey. Subscribe to Fictitious on iTunes, Google Play, or Spotify so you don't miss all of my upcoming interviews and reviews, and be sure to check out the previous author interviews exploring the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.